Amidawa Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I am Aaliyah Chavez. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, was passed in 1990. It was created in part to speed up the return of Native ancestral remains that were dug up and placed in museums. But 34 years later, and Native leaders say too many ancestors are still being held in public institutions. This year, new rules governing NAGPRA went into effect. ICT's Marionette Pember reports on how Native people hope the new rules will bring their ancestors home, as well as some much-needed healing.
As of January, nearly 100,000 Indigenous remains were still being stored in public institutions across the country. Recently, I visited one such institution in Ohio.
I'm standing on the campus of the Ohio History Connection in Columbus, Ohio, the home of the country's largest public collection of Native American, Native Hawaiian, and Alaska Native human remains. The organization and associated museum is headquartered in the building behind me. But the more than 7,000 ancestors' remains held by the Ohio History Connection are stored in warehouses nearby. Concerned about theft and vandalism, Ohio History Connection leaders wouldn't allow ICT News to film these buildings. The remains have languished here for decades, but recent changes in the federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, have placed a 5-year deadline for museums and public institutions, such as the Ohio History Connection, to repatriate ancestors' remains to tribes.
Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland.
My name is Brian Newland. I am a citizen of Bay Mills Indian community.
Says the new rules are long overdue and will help us, quote, heal from some of the more painful times in our past. Native leaders agree.
I think we all have heard these issues for generations. These are the things that our grandparents talked about, and this is something that we can do. You know, I think I don't know many families that would leave their relatives somewhere.
When we do things like repatriate the ancestral remains of Indigenous people, is we enhance everyone's humanity. We make it more possible for all of us to get along with one another.
Under the new NAGPRA regulations, Indigenous peoples will have the final word on the affiliation and disposition of the nearly 100,000 of their ancestors' remains held by institutions throughout the United States. In the past, organizations like the Ohio History Connection were the sole arbiters of which tribes, if any, had legitimate connections to these vast collections. By claiming that most remains were unaffiliated or unconnected to contemporary tribal groups, the institutions were legally allowed to keep ancestors in their collections to be used for research or other purposes. As of January 13, 2024, however, the supremacy of the Western worldview, at least in archaeological terms, has officially been put on notice.
Without a doubt, repatriation is more than a healing exercise. I think it really does something to change the power dynamics and also change public perception about who contemporary Native people are.
I don't know that America really understands how big this issue is.
Marionette Pember, ICT News.
That was the second of 3 segments we're running this week on the major changes to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Tomorrow, how some museums are making changes and helping to heal. To see the whole series, read more about these important issues, and watch extended interviews, visit us at ictnews.org. In Arizona, legislators approved a bill that regulates rehab programs from being targeted by Medicaid scams. Navajo State Senator Teresa Hitothli had unanimous support in the Senate last week for her bill that will prevent widespread fraud against those seeking help for addictions. The rehab facility scams have robbed hundreds of millions in Medicaid dollars, scamming hundreds of Native Americans. According to Hitothli, the bill will ensure checks and balances on an issue that's been affecting Native people since long before the pandemic. She anticipates a full House vote this week. In Washington, D.C., a ceremony was held to honor the establishment of a congressional charter to the National American Indian Veterans. The signing of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act granted the charter, which will allow Native veterans to have a voice in Washington. The group can now testify their concerns to Congress and talk directly to lawmakers about policy issues. South Dakota Senator Mike Rounds held the ceremony and hopes this larger platform will increase advocacy for more than 140,000 Native American veterans living in the U.S. In North Dakota, 200 wild horses could be removed from the Badlands of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The National Park Service is drafting a park management plan for livestock that could limit or remove the horses. The horses have powerful allies at hand, including the governor of North Dakota, U.S. Senator John Hoeven, and now Congress. The Interior and Environmental Budget Bill, which was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden, mentions keeping the horses in place. The Park Service aims to make a decision by the end of April.